In one hand, he's carrying a stone, while he shows the bread with the other. Plautus. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I'd like to thank you all for joining me this week. I appreciate the support. If you would be so kind as to like, rate, download, sub, whatever your platform of choice asks you to do to show support for a creator. I'd appreciate that if you would do that for me too. Excuse me. I also want to thank everyone for the birthday wishes. I had a couple of people reach out, and I appreciate that. It's very late for me. I just got back from seeing my family. Well, I didn't just get back. I've been back for a little while, but for whatever reason, I was just really not motivated to record tonight, but I want to get an episode out this week. So this one might be a little bit shorter, but I'm going to at least try to get us to 20 minutes, and maybe a little bit longer than that. But this week, we will be covering continuing developments made by descendants of the Cardium Ware / Cardium pottery culture in Italy and Sicily, and some other Mediterranean islands, up to the year 4000 BC, BCE, whichever of those you prefer. To that end, we should go ahead and start talking about the Stentinello culture. And this name comes from the type site of Stentinello, which was a village in Sicily. From what I can gather, the village has kind of since been absorbed into the suburbs of Syracuse. Though the main road that goes through the area is called the Via Stentinello. And I couldn't get a firm etymology for the name. It might be something like in hardship or in stone, but that's loosely based on an Italian etymology and not Sicilian, so I don't know which is more likely. Also, apparently, and I don't know if this is just Google Translate or whatever, but also Stentinello could mean like fender too, like a car fender, I'm assuming. So I'm not quite sure. Obviously, I don't think the village is named Fender. I'm sure there's some other older etymology I'm just wasn't able to find, I should say. Although, I should point out that this is only one name that the culture is known by. In eastern Sicily and the toe of the Italian peninsula or Calabria, it is referred to as Stentinello. It's also present on the island of Malta, where it is referred to as the Gardalam. And it's also present on a small chain of islands to Sicily's north called the Aeolian Islands. And it is referred to there as the Castellaro Vecchio. And I also saw, like on one page, that it was basically, it's described as like a variant of the Stentinello in western Sicily called the Cronio culture, but I wasn't able to find anything related to a culture called Cronio. Now there's a site that we'll talk about at like Mount Cronio. I don't know if those are exactly the same thing, but we'll get into that a little bit more shortly. Now, the timing on the Stentinello is a little hard to exactly tie down due to how it's spread geographically. And, some of their sites, especially on the islands, are a little, I wouldn't say isolated, but they're not quite as well populated, at least initially, and they kind of are holdouts. And in some cases, there's arguments that they continue the Stentinello kind of cultural tradition, or at least material cultural tradition, until parts of next season. Whereas, in Sicily or Calabria proper, maybe they've started to become something else. But we'll get into that. But generally speaking, it's usually dated to last basically the entirety of the 5th millennium BC. So from about 5,000 to about 4,000 BC, BCE, with maybe some holdouts, on one or two of their kind of peripheral sites. So they emerge about 500 years after the Cardium Ware or Cardium pottery culture declines. Now, they are descendants, of course, of the Cardium Ware culture's people. And they continue the expansion of what we would consider a typical Neolithic economy of agriculture and herding. And of course, since they're along the coast, they are also throwing in fish and shellfish and things like that. However, for the Stentinello culture, their expansion of agriculture and herding I wouldn't say it's slow is probably not the right term. However, they are doing much more supplemental work for their economy compared to other places where new Cardium Ware descendants are emerging. Their diet appears much more diverse. Some of their sites you see much more wild animal bones, both by numbers of bones and varieties of animals, than some of these other coastal Neolithic peoples. And this, along with some physical remains that they've seen in a couple of sites, has led to a fairly popular theory that in Sicily, at least, the Stentinello people were either able to incorporate the local Western hunter-gatherers in larger numbers than other people, or they were able to spread their economy to these hunter-gatherers who adopted it. And then, of course, later they would merge with either the Stentinello or the Stentinello's descendants. Which came first, essentially? Did they adopt the hunter-gatherers, and then, kind of carried on both economies, kind of not necessarily equally, but they carried them on to an extent at the same time? Or did, was there a higher level of trade with the hunter-gatherers giving more wild game to the Stentinello people in return for, crops and knowledge and that kind of thing? And then later, did they merge that way? So it's debated, but there does appear to be evidence that in Sicily, at least, they were much more successful at apparently peacefully incorporating hunter-gatherers, whereas in other places that's not so much of that's not really borne out by the archaeological record, even in theory. Now, of course, that's not to say that there would not be any remaining hunter-gatherers in Sicily after this period. There certainly are. There are going to be hunter-gatherers in Sicily for quite some time. Very small numbers, at least compared to their agricultural neighbors, but there are people who are going to continue to exist on kind of the outskirts and up in the mountains and some of the more isolated valleys in Sicily. But we'll talk more about that later. Now, in addition to developing a slightly different economic model than the Cardium Ware, another aspect that the Stentinello continued to develop from the Cardium Ware peoples was, of course, the production of pottery. Now, they continued to impress designs, but the patterns being impressed and etched onto their pottery was much different from what you would see in, say, the Cardium Ware. They don't really use shells, at least not in any of the examples I've seen. They mainly keep with kind of the line motif. However, they do a lot of different types of lines. They do long, they do short, they do curled, they do swirled, they do ones that are more angled, like acute angles. In my opinion, at least to me, it looks like the patterns they're kind of etching into their pottery is less, they're not using the sea shells anymore, the cardial shells. They're using designs that make it look more more like plants or natural growing things are being impressed onto the pottery. Things that look like they could be some type of fibrous vine or rope. They could be, grains of wheat or barley, both of which were grown by the Stentinello. So, like, to me, the patterns that are impressing on this pottery looks much more plant-based as opposed to, maybe these shell or animal-based patterns. But that's just my opinion. I'll post some videos on YouTube, or post pictures of the different remains we found. Another thing that they change up is the coloring on their pottery. They don't keep the darker colors. They have much less gray ware that the Cardium people had. Most of their pottery that I've seen the remains of is kind of a cream, or maybe a very light, or maybe like an off-white. In certain lights, they look yellow, which I don't think there's any that are actually yellow, but they're light enough that if you put a direct light on it, it's going to look more yellow than anything else. And of course, they also had light brown, very light reds. And I'll be sure to post a few different examples. There are some that they found that are very well made, that have held up well, and then there's some that they're just little sherds of them. But I'll try and remember to post those, and you guys can see what it reminds you of, and maybe you can fill something in there. Now they do continue to use other patterns too. Occasionally they'll do like smaller circles, but I didn't see any examples, and no one's mentioned it at all, of them continuing to use the cardial shells to impress patterns in their pottery. Now, another facet of the Cardium Ware that the Stentinello continue is the long scale kind of sailing that the Cardium Ware culture did. It's believed that the Stentinello, or maybe their immediate precursors, are the ones who first landed on and populated the island of Malta. Also the Aeolian Islands, which are also sometimes called the Lipari Islands. These are kind of, they're volcanically active islands just to the north of Sicily. Lipari being the biggest, which is why it's sometimes called the Lipari Islands. And there, I think today there's around like 15,000 people spread all across those. And they're very big tourist destinations, at least considered like for their size. Now there's a lot of, it's a volcanically active region, so there's a lot of smaller islands, but the largest ones are Lipari, Salina, Stromboli, Panarea, Vulcano, Filicudi, and Alicudi. Now, Lipari is the most important, at least for, the island's name, the chain's name for Lipari in certain situations, because it's the largest, but it's also very important for our time period because it's a very important source of obsidian. Now, there's obsidian sources in Sicily, but basically anywhere there's obsidian, typically humans, at least at this period, are going to want to live nearby there. And, because they are volcanic islands, the soil typically, if you have enough, precipitation or things like that to, keep your crops irrigated, typically they're fairly, productive farmlands. So the islands, they were not, bad places to set up shop, provided you didn't have any catastrophic earthquakes or volcanic explosions, which at least I haven't seen any mentioned in the record, at least for this period. Now, Malta, of course, a little bit further south than the islands are further north of Sicily. And of course, earlier I mentioned how it's thought that the island was first occupied during this period. Now, we have in earlier episodes talked about the potential for Mesolithic hunters to get to Malta prior to this. There is some thought that that's the reason the things like the dwarf elephants or the dwarf hippos or the giant swans, that's the reason they died out. Although, again, there has been some pushback on that theory in recent years because those species died out prior to the period that the Mesolithic hunters are supposed to have shown up, which was around 6,500, if that theory is correct. If they were going there, it's possible they were just making seasonal trips or, trips to stay there for a brief period before going back to Sicily. But regardless, by 5,000, well, again, this is another time debate. Some dates you'll see 5,600. Some things you'll see 5,400. So, I've also seen dates, saying 5,900. So, the dates are all over for when the Neolithic shows up to Malta. Regardless of when it exactly happens, if it is indeed the Cardium pottery culture that shows up there first, and then they leave, and then you have the Stentinello culture begin to show up on the island, it doesn't end very well. Very shortly after arriving on Malta, due to the agricultural practices, the island was actually mostly filled with forests, and to make room for the agricultural economy, they ended up cutting down most of the trees on the island, and that caused massive soil degradation. So the island is actually abandoned for right around 1,000 years, give or take, a century or two, one way or the other, before people make a return. Now, that would probably be, probably right around 4,600 or so, would be the time that you're seeing people maybe abandon Malta for that reason. Though it's possible that there may have been very small numbers still living on the island, just not just kind of eking out an existence. But eventually, of course, people will return. And when we talk about Malta next season, we've got some very interesting things to talk about. There's several what are called megalithic temples that kind of go up. Maybe even at the very end of this season. Some of the dating on this is debated. It could be as early as 4,000, though probably closer to 3,900, 3,800. So we'll be talking about those. And that's a very interesting appearance taking place on Malta. Nothing like it shows up in Sicily. So people are traveling to Malta almost apparently to exclusively build these temples there. But again, that's more that we'll, that's something we'll cover next season. Also, I've referred to Malta as, as one island, but there are actually, the country of Malta is actually 3 islands. It's Malta, Comino, and Gozo. And they're all collectively in the Maltese archipelago. The name for Malta comes from Greek, at least that's how we got it from, into English. It comes from the Greek word melite, meaning honey sweet, which the island was a very big producer of honey for a period. The Phoenician word was malith, which was like haven or sometimes a port, maybe. And, both of those terms lended themselves to different languages named for the island. But but they're not far off between the Greek and the Phoenician either. But the English version of the word comes from the Greek ultimately. Now, the small island between Gozo and Malta proper is known as I said in English, Comino. The Maltese is Cumuna, which it's basically cumin. The seed for the spice cumin was grown on the island, and that's where the name for the island comes from. Gozo, which in Maltese is Gaudix. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I may have butchered it. Maltese is kind of rough. Historically, in like classical antiquity, it was known as Golos. I should say it was known to the Greeks as Godos. Latin, it was probably something more like Gaudus or Gaullus. The Phoenician, it's a little hard, but Phoenician, like a lot of Semitic languages, they don't write the vowels, at least when they first developed the alphabet. They didn't write the vowel sounds, but it was like gual or gual. And that's what the Arabic name for the island came from. They got the name from the Phoenician root. In Arabic, the island was Gaudas or Gaudus. So not too far off from the Greek. But the name in Phoenician meant something like turnaround. So kind of sort of related to Malta. If Malta's a port, if you get the Gozo, turn around. I guess, I don't know. But it was kind of an interesting breakdown of those three, at least in my opinion. But I'm looking forward to getting back there and talking about the temples that pop up next season. So we've talked about the Aeolian Islands. We talked about Malta. Let's talk about Western Sicily and the supposed Cronio culture. Now, as I said, I couldn't find anything aside from one mention about like a variation culture of breaking off from the Stentinello called the Cronio culture. Now, there is a site at Mount Cronio, which is an island or a mountain kind of in the western half of Sicily. It has it's a geothermically very active area in kind of southwestern Sicily, and there's this like huge labyrinthine system of caves, and a lot of them are filled with sulfuric vapors. Some of the lower levels, the caves can like average 100 degrees Fahrenheit with like 100% humidity. And so it's so hot that like human sweat just won't evaporate. And you can get heat stroke there in less than 20 minutes if you're not in and out. And there's some pictures, and I'll put them in the episode, of guys wearing these like breathing regulators. They wear these like special suits. But in those caves, dated to right around 4000 BC, and there's later stuff there too, but they found these huge kind of ceramic jars that had material in them that could be scraped off and analyzed from said containers. So several different types of organic residue. Some had some animal fats. Others had some residues from some types of plants. So it was kind of they've been able to kind of tell that these were some types of stews. And those are from the oldest level. However, one jar, and this is dated to the later portion of the cave, so right around 3000 BC, they had pure grape wine stored there. So it's possible, because again, you're finding this one example. It's possible that grape wine could have been being produced in the area that early, or at least being traded in the area that early. Maybe not being made there, but so that's a possibility as well. Now, how closely connected are the people at Monte Cronio to the Stentinello culture? Well, I mean, I don't think they found any human remains, but obviously the pottery is something that you see with the Neolithic people, so they definitely have some continued interactions with people who are producing their own pottery in the area. And given the long-range trade networks that the Stentinello kind of, they take over the Cardium trade routes in the area, and they expand them. We haven't really talked about that too much. After some of these material cultures disappear, typically the trade slows down for a period, but then as like a new culture emerges, it typically picks back up at a higher level than what you saw before. This is because the population is growing. Now, what's being traded, of course, is slightly different. You'll see that there's a lot of raw materials being traded, things like obsidian from Sicily and things like that. They'll reach up into the Iberian Peninsula. They'll travel up to southern France for, those local varieties of stone, things that you wouldn't be able to find in Sicily. Silver, not necessarily during this season, but silver is an early major export from Iberia to Sicily. Make of that what you will. So the Stentinello, they could definitely have just sailed around the island and set up some outposts there. Although, if you look at later history, Sicily is very rarely unified, like at least at the early parts of recorded history. There's like three main, what one might consider indigenous ethnic groups, or at least, who've been living on the island for long periods of time together. There's some debate on which one showed up first, or, which, if they're all related. We'll talk more about that later. But, Sicily doesn't really get united until the Romans take over from the Carthaginians. And even then, they still technically have, Greek vassal states on the island for, most of the Republican era. I think that doesn't go away till, the imperial period. But, this could have been just kind of a regional variation. It's certainly possible. But again, I found no evidence that the Cronio culture is, something that's considered its own thing, at least during this period. Maybe I'll find out more about it, when I start reading up for next season. But yeah, so that's the. There are some other things I wanted to mention about this Stentinello culture. So we talked about their pottery, we've talked about their economy, what they have kind of developed from the preceding Cardium Ware culture, what they're kind of doing differently when it comes to, pottery or economy, how they've continued kind of the sailing aspect of their lives from the Cardium Ware culture. However, there is one thing I have not talked about that we do, kind of see. That's their housing. It's different from what we saw from the Cardium Ware. They have stone foundations at a lot of their sites, but they have found they're almost all the ground level. They have ditches kind of covering or surrounding their settlements. And their settlements typically, again, their homes are built on stone foundations. But they all of these foundations, they have found post holes. So it looks like that they were building their homes out of kind of a wooden superstructure with a stone foundation. So they were probably replacing the wood as needed, covering it with wattle, daub, leathers, things like that. And these homes are oval shaped, which is different from what you saw from the Cardium Ware. They were mostly rectangular homes, or square rectangular for the Cardium Ware. So that is another innovation or difference between the Stentinello and the Cardium Ware culture.
But yeah, we're right around 30 minutes. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and call it here. It's very late for me where I am, and I've got to get ready for work. And, well, first I've got to get this episode ready for publishing. So I'll include some photos. There probably won't be as much in this one. I'm basically going to have the highlights of what I've talked about, and I'll have a couple of map things to show as well. Next week we'll continue with the other emerging cultures that are coming out from the end of the Cardium Ware culture. But I hope you all have enjoyed. I appreciate your support again. Thank you all, especially my returning listeners. Sorry if this episode was a little bit rougher. Like I said, I'm a little tired. But if you guys do have any questions, comments, constructive criticism, please let me know. You can reach me at waradrevpod@gmail.com. You can contact me via direct message on X/Twitter, or you can contact me via messages on YouTube. You can comment on any of the videos. I will respond there as I can. And also, I do live stream during the weeks and weekend on occasion on both YouTube and Twitch. So if you see me live, feel free to stop by, ask questions there. You can't send links or anything on those platforms, but you can at least tell me about it. You can give me the name of the article, and I can look it up. But yeah, I hope you all have a good rest of your day and week from whenever you're listening to this, and I will see you all next time. Peace.